From the CISO series, it's Cybersecurity Headlines.
Threat actors turning to RDDoS attacks as a new ransom vector. Amazon considers tracking workers' keystrokes while Google considers cutting pay for work-from-home employees. And GitHub urges users to enable 2FA after going passwordless. These are just some of the stories my colleagues and I have been bringing to you on this week's cybersecurity headlines. And now we get a chance for some insight, opinion, and definitely some expertise on these stories and more from our guest, Will Gregorian, Head of Security and Technical Operations at Rhino. Will, thanks for being on the show today.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right, and we're going to be want to also thank our sponsor Capado for helping us bring this show to you. We'll be talking more about them in just a minute. And remember, you can join us on Crowdcast. If you just look up here, you see the URL to join us. Let us know, chat your thoughts on the stories as we go along. But we only got 20 minutes, so let's jump into it. Our first story of the day: a Ford bug exposed customer and employee records from internal systems. This bug on Ford Motor Company's website allowed access to sensitive systems and proprietary data, such as customer databases, employee records, and internal tickets. The data exposure stemmed from a misconfigured instance of a Pega Infinity customer engagement system running on Ford servers. The vulnerability was patched relatively quickly. However, the researchers are expressing frustration around Ford's unwillingness to cooperate on this issue of disclosure. And this, seems like it's always going to be a persistent issue, but specifically looking at the idea of third-party suppliers kind of being the weak link in, a lot of supply chains where we're talking about software or logistical and that kind of stuff. So, Will, should companies with the size and scope of Ford or, any Fortune 500, that kind of stuff, be forced to be more forthcoming and accountable when vendors mess up like this?
Absolutely. They made a business decision to go and, hire a third party. So why not? Frankly speaking, I'm actually kind of surprised that, the SEC doesn't require companies such as Ford to disclose these events in their 10Qs or Ks. So that's one part. But it's interesting that, you mentioned the frustration on the researcher side. I think that this was probably dozens of conversations within the ranks of Ford on how to basically react to the disclosure. So that's probably the reason why they were frustrated. And it took so long, but the remediation probably took like no more than a couple of hours. That's my guess. Yeah.
Well, and the issue then that becomes is then does almost using these third parties. Now, obviously, Ford, it is not in Ford's interest to have this kind of exposure or have a weak link, but to use these third parties, knowing to some degree that something is going to slip through, and then you have this, this kind of deniability, as long as it's not legally mandated, right?
Probably. Look, I don't mean to speculate. It's
not
kind
Ford
of easy for us to
specifically,
do
but
that. We could always sit here from the peanut gallery and throw at them. Look, the reality nowadays is that you're always going to use a third party regardless of who you are. How you react to basically security or op events is really a matter of business. We just haven't gotten to the point where we're actually exercising that muscle memory. Even companies outside of Ford, I would imagine their scale is so big that they're still trying to figure it out. So yeah.
Yeah. All right, our next story here: threat actors turning to RDDoS attacks as a new ransom vector. A ransom DDoS attack is an extortion scheme in which cybercriminals do something like either launching a DDoS attack and then demanding a ransom to stop, or they ask for a ransom first and then the DDoS hits. I think the second one's a little more audacious. RDDoS does not require time and planning like malware or ransomware does, where you kind of have to be in the system first and then kind of have to plan all that out, and has the added benefit of being harder to trace back to its origin, at least according to a Neustar representative we cited in our coverage here. So, Will, the question is, is this old or kind of a new development here? Obviously, DDoSes are nothing new, but this kind of ransom element, kind of a new twist on the ransom extortion schemes that were so commonplace now.
It's not so much of a new twist. Old is new, new is old. It's interesting. I think that, somebody probably had their own version of Loic and they decided to weaponize and monetize it. And let's face it, criminals are enterprising. They're like, you know what? We could probably make money in the least path of resistance instead of using the strategy as they used with the other major breaches, where they had to sort of remain dormant in certain networks before they could actually launch an attack. So kudos to them. Too bad for us, and we're still going to see it. Yeah, I mean, like, this goes back to DR. Be prepared.
Yeah, and if anything, this may signal be a sign that it's easier now to coordinate DDoS attacks versus the level of effort needed to do this. I mean, that's what it all comes down to: is ransomware as a service takes off, which makes the level to do a ransomware attack much lower. Maybe DDoS attacks, the infrastructure for that is getting easier, at least at this time, and maybe that's why we're seeing a rise in that as well.
100%. Look, it's astounding. Like, there were basically marketplaces for sort of like, DOS as a service out there. So
Yeah.
they're getting better. They're becoming even more efficient. They're basically figuring it out. It's a cat and mouse game, but nonetheless, this is the reason why we exist in cybersecurity.
Moving on to our next story, Amazon and Google think hard about work from home employees. We've got a double story here for this, but I think they're kind of two sides of the same coin. First, when we're looking at things like data theft, insider threats, and imposters have really gotten bad for Amazon, to the point where they're considering rolling out keyboard stroke monitoring for their customer service reps. Some would say draconian, others would say incredibly draconian. This would likely apply to only outsourced employees working from home in countries like India and the Philippines, but looking at using behavior analysis software to track mouse clicks, keystrokes, looking for those insider threats. Then Google has developed a pay calculator that lets employees see the effects of working remotely or coming back into offices, with some remote employees, especially those with a long commute, possibly seeing a pay cut as a result. Other big companies, we're talking Microsoft, Facebook, Twitter, have offered less pay for employees based on that are coming from lower rent locations. But smaller firms such as Reddit and Zillow have said that they will pay the same no matter where employees are based, saying that it improves diversity. Well, I think every company is trying to figure out hybrid work, return to office, this whole kind of puzzle from a variety of perspectives. Security on Amazon's part, Google may be looking for cost of living and that kind of stuff. Do these seem like sound financial or business strategies, or where do we see the backfiring here?
Yeah, I think it's financial and business first and foremost. Then it's security. My speculation is that the Amazon strategy is more than likely going to end up being a preview for U.S. employees. So watch out for that one.
Mm-hmm.
But here's the reality: when you look at the financial industry, when you look at sort of like the public sector, DLP, for the lack of a better word, has always existed. It's always been there. And there are certain assumptions that, your keystrokes are being logged and you're being surveilled. So don't be surprised that somebody that, tells you, hey, what were you doing? In this case, I'm glad that Amazon cares about me as a customer, that they don't want my shopping habits to basically, get out there. I read the article. It was fascinating nonetheless. But I also couldn't understand exactly what threat model they were trying to address. And I have to ask, what happened to least privilege, need to know, role-based access control, all of the above? I mean, does that suggest that their customer service employees over in India and Philippines have unfettered access to the data? That seems kind of odd to me. Yeah.
Well, what I was going to say is that like a signal to, is that it become a signal to noise problem, where instead of, you're looking at file level access and you're using those to kind of pull signals out, which I know for a lot of insider threat modeling is kind of, the basis of that, looking at individual keystrokes, it seems like you're just adding a lot of stuff to have to analyze with a lot of overhead, not necessarily a lot of benefit.
You are going to have a collective effort, and then you're going to basically burn out a number of information security professionals who have to monitor this. I don't care how good this, the security system is or how good that technology is. You still have to have human beings who are going to basically read through the normalized data. At the scale of Amazon, there are billions of lines. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how this is going to pan out. Yeah.
All right, before we move on to our next story, I want to take a few moments and thank our sponsor, Capado. The traditional development lifecycle is a game of trade-offs. You either deploy at blazing speed and put yourself at risk of bugs and breaches, or you shore up your security and release software at a snail's pace. But with Capado DevOps, you get the best of both worlds. Leverage Capado's low-code DevOps platform to drive 94% fewer production bugs, 95% faster releases, and an average ROI of 307%. To get a free demo, visit capado.com. All right. Next story that we wanted to, Will, to get your thoughts on: terrorist watch list has been exposed online, at least seemingly. Security researcher has discovered an Elasticsearch cluster containing records of 1.9 million people from an apparent watch list that includes names, citizenship, date of birth, passport details, and what's raising a few eyebrows: no-fly status. The server with the list was indexed by the search engine Census and Zoomeye before being discovered. Likely others have had access at this point. Data fields indicate it could have belonged to the FBI's terrorist screening center. This was discovered by security researcher Bob Dianchenko, who's kind of made it his personal quest to kind of look for these kind of exposed buckets. Doing great work, by the way. I love seeing his reporting. And he said that the report of the server to the Department of Homeland Security the day it was discovered only went offline 3 weeks later. The big issue here is, I mean, obviously this list is important, but it's that speed of response, and makes me question, are we hearing the whole story? This list may have been generated by the Department of Homeland Security, but who knows how many different contractors have had access to this at this point. This is one of those things where for this list to be useful, it needs to be accessed by other people. And that kind of opens a big security, flaw where anyone that has access to this list has presumably access to cloud resources that could expose it to the broader internet. Do we need, is this in itself like a big, I guess, how do we handle this kind of security problem with a list that we want people to have when they need it?
Yeah, so this wasn't what we had in mind for digital transformation, and I would guess that the feds are basically thinking hard and long about this. And then this begs the question. I mean, there is a reason why we have control frameworks like 853, where there is sort of the apparatus of change management and network security and baseline config. So what happened to any of that? I'm guessing that somebody would basically had to get something done yesterday, and they took a few shortcuts, which basically led to the op event. So here we are. We'll never know, and we'll never understand and read the whole story. Let's just face it, it goes into chain of custody. No lessons learned there. So good luck. We can deduce and guess what happened, but we'll definitely not know what happened. I think that unfortunately, the Fed is pretty big, and their systems are extremely complicated. The interoperability between the interagency communication is, I'm sure, just as complicated. My hope would be that they would start sort of exploring maybe using REST APIs where data access is a little bit better controlled versus I'm guessing they probably use SFTP, but again, I never worked for the Fed, so I don't know.
The Feds, they love their FTP. All right.
They do.
Next story up. T-Mobile says hackers stole records belonging to 48.6 million individuals. This is a follow-up to a story we've been covering kind of over the last week. We now have confirmation that T-Mobile has had its sixth major data breach in the last 4 years. According to T-Mobile, attackers breached its servers and stole files containing the personal information of roughly 7.8 million current T-Mobile postpaid customers, 850,000 T-Mobile prepaid users, and 40 million former or prospective customers. This was where they had applied for credit, and those people are included in this data set. T-Mobile has already reset all of the PINs for affected accounts and is offering 2 years of free identity protection with McAfee's ID theft protection service. This seems like, we get data breaches. This data set contains social security numbers, and it seems like, hey, that free ID protection is the equivalent of thoughts and prayers for a lot of these companies. Is this a valid response to breaches like this?
It's not a valid response. I think it's the equivalent of having that free shrimp cocktail and drinks on the Vegas floor, and the house always wins. It's interesting. I have actually colleagues and friends who were basically affected by this data breach. I told them, I said, just pay out of pocket, go freeze your credit, and apply monitoring. 2 years, in my opinion, is not long enough for credit monitoring. And the reason why is because when you think about it, the bad actors at this point have all the data in the world. They could essentially sit on the rotating data, wait for that 2 years to expire, and then launch their attack, and they'll probably be successful. But that's not the point of focus. The point of focus that I want to make here is that I would like to see a world where the Fed, say in the form of FTC and the SEC, has enough teeth to sink into this and effectively, enact a cybersecurity oversight committee to inflict pain on repeat offenders like T-Mobile, and to basically, influence their, security posture from the inside. But let's face it, we're in a capitalistic society, and that's never going to work. Meanwhile, all of our social security numbers and all of our identities are being affected by this. So it's a very interesting world. But yeah, the TLDR here is that we're going to err on the side of class action lawsuits. So prepare for that one.
Yeah, and what makes this, I guess, vexing for a lot of people is that this came to light because someone was trying to sell this on on a hacker forum somewhere. It wasn't like T-Mobile was like, slowly like rolled it out. We've seen that a number of times, right? We're
Right.
admitting that there's an issue. We're hearing from the threat actors first in this regard, and I think that causes, certainly a lot of bad ill will
Yeah.
in this
Yeah.
instance.
Isn't it always nice to know, like, you failed?
Kudos on the marketing, honestly, for that hacker forum. They got the word out. I guess if they wanted to sell those 30 million or 40 million or something like that. So
I would find them and hire them to tell me what I did wrong.
well, that was oh gosh, now I'm fading that crypto network that got hacked that ended up
That's
offered the
right.
bug bounty on that last week.
Yes.
So that's
Yes.
the move. It seems like.
Yep.
Our next story today: data sovereignty laws place new burdens on CISO. An article written by Christopher Burgess and posted this week on at CISO Online quotes a number of studies and experts showing how the exponential growth of data crossing borders and public cloud regions is making it exceedingly difficult for CISOs whose customer base or digital infrastructure crosses political boundaries. We're seeing this across the board at this point. It used to just kind of be an EU, kind of a bugbear, for lack of a better term. We're seeing it now pretty much internationally. Do you anticipate kind of, I guess, more of this type of awareness for the territoriality of data? And how should CISOs prepare for, this changing legal landscape?
Gosh, how many times have I been in conversations where we started with customer X, Y, and Z demands that the data be hosted in Switzerland? Yeah, so like, there's actually someone that in my network that's like, super smart, and I'll quote him on this. When did the CISO become the cul-de-sac of debt? It's interesting. I don't understand, and I read the article, but it seemed to insinuate that the CISO is the first line function and has to sort of like define those parameters from a data sovereignty perspective. I never once saw a mention of legal or any of the teams that essentially orchestrate the config management around data hosting. Say in the cloud, well, Amazon has the data regions to be able to sort of like nip this thing on its butt, but yet we're talking about the CISO. I think that by the time the CISO is involved in any of these conversations, it's either reactive or there is some proactive measure around incident response, and they're basically coordinating the effort. And by then, it's a little too late. So yeah, perhaps there is a misunderstanding on my part, or maybe this is my naivete, but I just couldn't get the article. I mean, it starts talking about the CISO and how they're burdened. I was like, where's everybody else?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, that's a perfect. I mean, it's what is it? People, process, and technology, right? You need kind of for obviously a variety of things, but especially with this kind of coordination. That's a really great point about, hey, where's the legal team? Like
It was never ever mentioned. I even did a Control F and I searched for legal. I couldn't find it.
That's an excellent point, and something that it may seem impossible, and maybe it is, looking at it as just the CISO's job to take care of, and that this is obviously requires coordination across all business efforts at this point.
Yeah, look, even if you were to sort of like deduce that the CISO organization is essentially like monitoring the oversight and the compliance portion of it, I would imagine that the legal arm is setting up the parameters around where the data should be hosted. The CISO organization is very effectively going through and methodically, frankly speaking, around the data classification to sort of define. And then monitor. And then you have your sort of like, DevOps likes, SRE types, your developers who are effectively like running the first line. If they're not doing that, then yeah, you do have a problem, and the CISO is burdened with all of this. But I would say that, the start of the conversation is first line, not the second line. And the way I look at CISO functions, they're the second line.
All right, well, we'll get you out on this last story here. GitHub urges users to enable 2FA after going passwordless. GitHub is urging users to adopt two-factor authentication after deprecating password-based authentication for Git operations last Friday. The company's chief security officer, Mike Hanley, recommends using physical security keys, virtual security keys built into devices, things like phones and laptops, or time-based one-time password authenticator apps. However, not SMS-based 2FA. That's kind of a familiar refrain we've been hearing. Is this leading the way to our passwordless MFA universe? Is GitHub behind or ahead of the times here? Will?
Gosh, yeah, okay. So that's a neat trick. Let's see if we can basically do that for the mom and pop consumers. I would say the majority of the GitHub prosumers, frankly speaking, are your
Mhm.
developer type. So they've already embraced MFA. Frankly speaking, they're probably like, asking for a lot of questions around passwordless many years ago. So welcome to the show. I'm glad that Mike and team are now basically like, catching everybody up. It is definitely a good indicator. It's a good predictor around like, market adoption, but I'm not so convinced that, it will apply to your consumers yet. If it took GitHub as long as it has to sort of like, apply this for what I would consider to be like very tech forward and savvy individuals and groups, then it kind of is like an indicator around like how much longer it's going to take for like, sort of like your average, like, people to adopt it. So yeah, there's probably like a good runway there. Yeah. So let's see when Amazon deploys this.
Well, they'll be monitoring your keystrokes when you put in your
Oh
two-factor
yeah.
password. So we'll know that for sure. But before we get out of here, well, this has been fantastic. Was there a story that stood out to you, a favorite, or maybe one that just your eyes just rolled to the back of your head? What struck you?
Yeah, so I think the one that struck me is Google, because I think like, like I actually experienced some of that, and
Mhm.
my experience is somewhat adjacent to the cost of living adjustments, given the fact that I relocated outside of California, so I'm part of that exodus. I think that companies really do need to like take a good hard look at their business strategy around their employee retention, et cetera. I would say that, frankly speaking, they benefit from the work from home just as much as their employees do when you consider the operating cost reduction, the carbon footprint, everything else above. So yeah, give it time. And I would probably say, bosses who basically desire for employees to be physically located right next to them, bosses will eventually retire. So I'm looking forward to the world where, we embrace the 21st century style workforce, and we sort of like expunge ourselves from the 20th century work style.
Well, Will Gregorian, thank you so much, head of security and technical operations at Rhino. But if people aren't checking you out there, where else can people find you?
I'm on LinkedIn, and I am definitely on Twitter, so very active on both. Go for it.
Excellent, excellent. We also want to thank our sponsor, Capado. Thanks so much for supporting the show. And remember, you can get cybersecurity headlines every single day in your podcast app of choice. 6 minutes, keep you up on the news. And remember to come back next week for our Friday video chat, Hacking User Adoption, an hour of critical thinking about improving acceptance and usage of new technology. It starts 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, you choose, following by speed dating. And then we'll be back with another week another edition of the Week in Review, Friday, 12:30 p.m. Eastern, 3:30 Pacific. Until then, I'm Rich Straffolino. Have a super sparkly day.
Cybersecurity headlines are available every weekday. Head to CISOseries.com for the full stories behind the headlines.